She doesn't matter. I was standing less than 10 steps from the mansion gate when I heard my daughter-in-law say that to the security guard, pointing at my wife as if she were an extra detail. Grace didn't react. She only tightened her grip on her handbag. The irony is this. In that moment, no one at this lavish birthday party understood that everything they were standing in existed because of the woman who had just been called unimportant. And a few seconds later, one card made the entire place fall completely silent. Before the story continues, if that moment just touched something in you, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Because sometimes a single, dismissive sentence becomes the starting point of everything. I never thought a casual sentence could hang in the air for so long. She doesn't matter. It wasn't said loudly. It wasn't aimed at me. Just enough for the security guard to hear, and for my wife standing a few steps away. But I heard it clearly. At 70, my hearing isn't what it used to be. Still, some sentences don't need ears to be heard. The car we arrived in was an old sedan, the paint faded from years of sea sun. I turned off the engine and opened my door. Grace stayed seated for a few seconds, adjusting the thin scarf on her shoulders. The gate to the seaside estate was brightly lit. The lights reflected off tall glass panels, turning everything into a kind of stage. There, Caroline stood in the middle of a well-dressed group. Behind her were security guards in black suits, earpieces in place. Her 30th birthday party was staged like a brand launch. The guests weren't just friends. They were names spoken with titles. People didn't greet each other by name, but by estimated worth. Grace and I walked forward. We didn't hurry. There was no reason to rush at a party we had been invited to. Even if the invitation came late and without warmth, Caroline turned when she heard our footsteps. Her eyes passed over me, then lingered on my worn shoes longer than necessary. They moved on to the dark leather bag in Grace's hand. No greeting, just the faintest curl of her lips. Enough for me to know we were inconveniencing her. "Where's the VIP list?" Caroline asked the guard without looking at us. The guard opened his tablet and glanced at Grace. "Ma'am, this lady is—" Grace hadn't answered yet when Caroline leaned in, lowered her voice, and said the sentence I had already heard. It was tossed out like a scrap of paper, but it landed squarely in the invisible room where I had placed my entire life. "She doesn't matter. Just an old helper I allowed to come assist in the kitchen. Don't put her on the main list." No one laughed. No one objected. The people around us either didn't hear it or heard it and chose to look away. I understood that faster than I expected. I looked at Grace. She didn't seem surprised. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Just a very thin smile, like when she hears news whose ending she already knew. In that moment, I understood why for 40 years Grace had always held the key to my family's hardest decisions. Not because she was tough, but because she knew when silence carried more weight. The security guard hesitated. He looked at Caroline, then at Grace, as if searching for a detail that didn't add up. His hand rested on his radio, but he didn't lift it. "I'll have them escorted to the back area," Caroline continued, her tone firm. "They need more people there." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of the confidence behind it. At my age, I've seen many people say similar things, right before everything turned in a way they never saw coming. Bennett was standing a few meters from the gate. My son wore an expensive suit, his tie perfectly set, a glass of wine untouched in his hand. He looked at us, then at Caroline. His eyes passed over me quickly, as if I were a small obstruction in a much larger frame. I waited for a nod, a word, any sign that he recognized we weren't strangers. But Bennett only tilted his head slightly, avoided my gaze, and stepped aside, clearing the way for Caroline to keep giving orders. In that moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt an emptiness. I remembered late nights in offices decades ago, signing documents the press was never shown in full, short phone calls, decisions with no room for emotion. I had thought that, in old age, I would no longer need that kind of weight. But standing at that mansion gate, I realized something simple. Power doesn't disappear. It just stays quiet until it's dismissed. Grace placed her hand on my arm, a very light touch, just enough to remind me that everything was still within her control. She said nothing. She didn't need to. We were led through a side entrance where the light dimmed and the music faded. Behind me, I heard Caroline laughing loudly with someone, as if she had just handled a minor, forgettable task. But for me, that was the first moment of an evening where every role was about to be reversed. And I knew this. All it would take was for Grace to open that handbag, and nothing would ever go back to the way it was. The side path led us around to the back of the mansion, where the lights no longer shone straight into people's faces. Out there, the music was reduced to a thin layer in the background, just enough to remind us the party was still happening, but not enough to cover the feeling of being pushed aside. A staff member opened a small storage room near the kitchen and gestured for us to go in. Inside were a few folding tables, metal trays, and the smell of food that hadn't fully cooled yet. This was where the workers stood to rest between shifts, not a place for guests, and certainly not for the parents of the host. Bennett appeared a few minutes later. He didn't look directly at me. His voice was low and rushed, as if he wanted the conversation to end as quickly as possible. "Mom and Dad can sit here for now. It's too crowded out there." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted to see if he would say anything else. He didn't. He turned away immediately, as if staying any longer would force him to explain something. Grace sat down on a wooden chair against the wall. She placed her handbag on her lap, fingers interlaced. I sat across from her, watching her face under the cold, fluorescent light. There was no sign of hurt, only a familiar clarity. A group of servers walked past, glanced at us, then looked away. I caught fragments of whispered words, but not enough to make sense of them. In places like this, people learn not to ask too much. After a while, Caroline walked in. She had changed into another dress, brighter, tighter. She looked around as if checking that everything matched her expectations. When she saw Grace, her gaze stopped. "That ring," Caroline said, her voice even but edged with irritation. "You should take it off. It doesn't fit the atmosphere of the party." Grace looked down at her hand. The old pearl ring, its surface, dulled by time. She wore it almost every day, not for its value, but out of habit. She looked up at Caroline, the thin smile still there. "It doesn't bother anyone," Grace said. Caroline exhaled as if being patient with something beneath her attention. "It ruins the overall aesthetic. My guests are very refined. I don't want them to get the wrong idea." I looked at Caroline, then at Bennett standing behind her. My son avoided my eyes and stared at the floor. There was no objection, not even the smallest gesture to suggest he understood that what was happening was wrong. Grace stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then she removed the ring and placed it into her handbag. Not because she was forced, but because she had decided this argument wasn't worth extending. I knew that look well. It was the look of someone who was remembering, not enduring. Caroline turned away right after satisfied that order had been restored the way she wanted. I sat there, hands resting on my knees, and an old memory came back with sharp clarity. Many years ago, in a closed meeting room, I had signed a decision that caused an entire bank to shut down in silence. No shouting, no chaos. Just a sequence of consequences unfolding slowly, exactly as planned. Back then, I had thought I never wanted to stand on the other side of that silence. But life has its own way of bringing people back to familiar positions. The music from the main hall suddenly grew louder. I heard applause. Laughter. Caroline was probably raising a glass, saying something about success, about new connections, about the future. I wondered how many of the people listening knew whose name this mansion was registered under. Grace turned to me. "You don't need to say anything," she said softly. "Today isn't the time." I nodded. I trusted her. Always had. A server brought in a simple tray of food and set it on the table. "For the two of you," the young woman said, avoiding eye contact. I thanked her. She nodded and hurried away, as if afraid of being seen talking to us. We ate in silence. Not because of the food, but because each of us was following a separate line of thought. I thought about Bennett. About the times I signed my name for him. The times I stood behind him, letting him believe his success was entirely his own. I had thought that was the best way to raise a man. Grace was different. She saw everything as a larger picture. And in that picture, Caroline was just a stroke, drawn too boldly, throwing the balance off. Quick footsteps echoed outside the door. A security staff member leaned in, speaking quietly to a colleague about a line of vehicles stopping at the main gate. I didn't catch the details. I only noticed the brief tension on his face. Grace lifted her head. Her expression shifted ever so slightly. Not worry, preparation. I understood then that this dinner meant for the help was coming to an end. Not because we would be invited to the main table, but because a different order was about to be restored. And I knew this. When Grace stood up again, the pearl ring would no longer be the thing anyone noticed. The music from the main hall suddenly dropped, as if someone had brushed against a switch they were never meant to touch. I heard radios murmuring in the corridor, faster, more urgent than before. Footsteps that usually moved with practiced calm turned hurried. Grace stood up. No one told her to. She simply rose, took her handbag, and adjusted the scarf on her shoulders. A small gesture, but enough for me to know that the moment of not yet had passed. We stepped out of the kitchen area, just as one of the security managers was speaking with Caroline near the entrance to the hall. From a distance I saw her frown, shaking her head, again and again, pointing toward the main gate. A line of sleek black cars waited outside, headlights still on engines running. Those cars didn't belong to random guests. They were waiting. "There's no name on the list," Caroline said loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. "Tonight is a private party. You're disturbing my guests." The security manager replied quickly, his voice low. Caroline answered with an impatient wave of her hand. I watched the scene with a familiar feeling, like replaying an old tape. Meetings that began with that kind of confidence rarely ended the way the speaker expected. A few guests turned around, curious. The air in the hall shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses were set down. Grace stepped out from the side passage. No one noticed right away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't seek the light. She walked straight toward the security team and stopped at just the right distance. Close enough to be heard, not close enough to draw attention. "What's going on?" Grace asked, her voice steady. Caroline turned. For a brief second, she didn't seem to recognize Grace. Then her expression darkened. "You don't need to worry," she said. "I'm handling it." Grace nodded as if accepting that answer. Then she turned to the security manager. "May I see the scanner?" she asked. He hesitated. He looked at Caroline. Caroline opened her mouth to speak, but Grace had already opened her handbag. I stood a few steps away, close enough to see the card when it appeared. No large logo, no decoration. A black titanium card slim-edged its surface, catching the light in a way that felt out of place, as if it belonged somewhere else entirely. Grace didn't raise it. She placed it gently into the security manager's hand. "Just scan it," she said. The sound that followed was unlike any confirmation tone I had heard in recent years. Not a short beep. It was longer, deeper, a sequence designed not to be mistaken. Immediately, the manager straightened. His hand left the radio. Something in his eyes changed. Within seconds, the guards around him adjusted their positions. No one gave an order, but the order had already rearranged itself. The main gate opened fully. The line of black cars rolled forward, then stopped. The man who stepped out of the first car didn't look around. He walked straight toward Grace, stopped at a respectful distance, and bowed his head. "Madam," he said, clear and composed, "we've been waiting for your signal all evening." There was no whispering, no laughter. I saw Bennett standing frozen near the main table, the glass in his hand tilting without him noticing. Caroline was different. She stood completely still, as if she had just been pushed out of a role she believed was hers. Grace simply nodded. "Please come inside," she said. "It's cold out there." The guests from the motorcade entered the hall. No introductions, no lists. Some of them were faces I had seen before. On financial news pages I knew well. I watched the expressions of the other guests change. Those who had been the center of attention stepped back, making room without being asked. Caroline tried to recover her voice. "What is this?" she asked. No one answered. Grace turned to her. No accusation, no long explanation. "This house," she said slowly, "has its own rules, and those rules are not written on your list." The air in the hall grew heavy. I felt every second pass. Not chaos. Recognition. A silence spreading outward like a large door closing and everyone inside suddenly understanding which side they were on. Bennett stepped forward as if to speak. Then he stopped. I looked at my son, and for the first time that evening I saw real confusion in his eyes. Grace placed the card back into her handbag. She turned to me, calm as ever. I gave a very slight nod. I knew then, from that moment on, this birthday party no longer belonged to Caroline, and what was about to be said next would not need to be said loudly. The silence lasted longer than I expected. No one dared to be the first to break it. Guests who had once stood at the center now stepped back on their own clearing space for a new order that had just been established, without a single announcement. Grace walked slowly into the middle of the hall. She didn't take over the room. She simply stood there, as if the space had always known her presence. I walked beside her, fully aware of the eyes turning toward us. They were no longer curious. They were reassessing. Caroline spoke first. "I don't understand what this is," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to stay composed. "This is our house." Grace looked at her for a long moment. Not the look of a winner, but of someone deciding whether anything more needed to be said. Finally, she gave a very slight shake of her head. "No," Grace said. "This is the place you are staying." The words weren't loud, but I saw Bennett flinch. He stepped forward, standing beside Caroline, as if trying to shield her from something he couldn't quite see. "Mom, Dad," Bennett said quietly, "if there's a misunderstanding, we can talk later. Today is Caroline's birthday." I looked at my son. This time I didn't avoid his eyes. I had allowed too many things to be left for later, and that was exactly how we ended up here. "Bennett," I said slowly, "do you remember whose name this house is registered under?" He stayed silent. Caroline turned to him, waiting for a clear answer, but Bennett said nothing. That silence answered for him. Grace opened her handbag again and took out a thin stack of papers. Not thick, not bound in anything elegant, just documents I had once signed, read, and considered carefully before putting my name on them. "This mansion," Grace said, "belongs to the family trust. I am the sole trustee. The right to use it was granted under very clear conditions." She paused. "Respect." I saw Caroline step back. "That's impossible," she said. "Bennett told me Bennett was allowed to say what he believed was true," I interrupted. "We let that happen. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact placed on the table." Grace continued, her tone unchanged. "The startup capital for Bennett's company. This house, the trips, the gifts, they all exist within the same support structure. And that structure exists because we believed the family would be protected." Some of the nearby guests began to understand. I saw their eyes move from Caroline to Grace, then to me. No one spoke, but the shift was unmistakable. Caroline turned to Bennett. "You knew about this?" she asked, panic no longer hidden. Bennett swallowed. "I didn't ask." That answer made the room feel heavier, not because it was shocking, but because it fit too well. Grace nodded once. "Then now you know." She signaled to one of the assistants who had arrived with the motorcade. The person stepped forward and handed Caroline a thin envelope. There was no need to open it to understand. "The right to use this house," Grace said, "ends tonight. And everything else I added will be reviewed. According to the agreement." Caroline shook her head and stepped back again. Her dress caught on the edge of a table. No one reached out. No one laughed. There was no satisfaction in the air, only a chain of consequences beginning to move. Bennett turned to me. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking, "I didn't know it would come to this." I looked at him for a long time. I remembered the days when he was small, running through our old house, believing everything would always be there. I had thought shielding him was love. Maybe I was wrong. "You knew long enough to ask," I said, "but you chose not to." Grace placed her hand on my arm, the familiar touch, reminding me to keep my voice where it needed to be. "We didn't come here to ruin a party," she said to Bennett. "We came to close a door." A few guards stepped forward. They didn't crowd anyone. They simply took the positions required. Their presence alone kept things from crossing a line. Caroline looked around, searching for the support she was used to. But the faces that had smiled at her earlier now avoided her eyes. I realized then, power doesn't need to be forced. It only needs to be reminded. Grace gathered the papers and returned them to her bag. She turned to me. "Let's go." I nodded. As we walked out, no one stopped us. No one called after us. No plea came loud enough to change anything. Behind us, the party lights were still on, but it had lost its center. And I knew that was something that could not be undone. We left the hall without looking back. The glass doors closed behind us so softly they barely made a sound. But I knew, for those still inside, that sound would echo for a long time. Outside, the sea wind felt colder than I expected. The lights along the path were still on, still guiding the way to the parking lot like when we arrived. The difference was this: no one was watching which path we took anymore. Grace walked slowly, her handbag held close. I opened the car door for her out of old habit. She sat in the passenger seat, closed the door, and let out a quiet breath. Not relief, not exhaustion. It was the breath of someone who had finally set down a weight she had carried for far too long. We drove in silence for the first few minutes. The coastal road grew darker, the lights behind us fading into a blur. I knew that back at the mansion, Bennett and Caroline were facing a very large emptiness. But for the first time, I didn't feel the need to fill it for them. Do you feel guilty? Grace asked, her voice even. I thought for a moment. Yes, I said, but not because of what we did tonight. Grace nodded. She understood. My guilt came from the years before. From the times I chose silence when I should have spoken. From the times I shielded my son when I should have let him face his limits. We didn't go straight home. I turned onto a small road that led to an old diner by the sea. The sign was faded. The windows no longer new. This was a place Grace and I had stopped at long ago. Before titles, before trusts, before lavish parties we could be excluded from. We sat at a table near the window. No one recognized us, and that made it easier to breathe. A young server brought 2 glasses of water and smiled naturally. No scrutiny, no measuring. Grace placed her handbag on the chair beside her. It looked exactly the same as it had at the mansion gate, but now it wasn't heavy anymore. Tonight, Grace said, you saw Bennett differently. I saw him as he is, I replied. Not as I hoped he would be. She didn't say anything more. There was no need. We ate slowly, talking about small things. The weather, the coastal road, an old memory with nothing to do with money or power. Those things felt like they had been left behind with the party lights. My phone vibrated a few times. I didn't open it. I knew who it was. I knew what it would say. But tonight I didn't need to answer right away. Some doors once closed don't need to be tested again. When we stood up to leave the diner, I opened my phone and went to my contacts. I found a name that had been there for a very long time, attached to a note I once thought would never change. I deleted that note. No anger, no drama, just a necessary action. On the drive home, Grace leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She looked calmer than I expected. I realized then the kindness she always carried was not unconditional endurance. It was a choice with limits. When we stopped in front of our house, I turned off the engine, but didn't get out right away. I looked at our home, simple, quiet. No guards, no lists. Tonight, I said, we didn't destroy anything. Grace opened her eyes and looked at me. We just put things back where they belong. I nodded. Status in the end is just a shell people wear. It can be mistaken, misplaced, taken away. But respect is different. It clings to a person like skin. When all the decorations are stripped away, what remains is what decides who you truly are. I knew Bennett would have to learn that lesson the harder way, the way I once hoped he wouldn't. But some lessons can't be taught with words. That night I slept better than I expected. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped trying to hold on to a role that no longer fit. And when the morning light filled the room, I understood this. Some endings are quiet, but they open the door to a very real kind of peace. If this story made you slow down for a moment, please tap like to support the values of kindness that still matter. Subscribe to the channel if you believe real-life stories without glamour still have the power to move the heart. And share this story if you've ever seen someone judged only by appearances. The final lesson is simple. Status can be misgiven. Money can change hands, but respect cannot be borrowed. How we treat others, especially family, reveals who we are when all the lights are turned off. Thank you for listening to my story.